Last week, I don't know whether you were here with us last week, but we picked up on a part of James. We've been going through the book of James, and we'd gone through James 4, at least the first half of it. And then we picked up last Sunday on a bit where, in the context of calling people to humility, and it's in the context of tensions and difficulties, and of course all the kind of relational issues that we can have that get exaggerated when we're under pressure. He said these words in James 4:11. Do not slander one another. Whoever speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. Because when you judge the law, you're not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. And he's talking here really about, how in judgments we make pronouncements. We tend to give verdicts, and we give verdicts on other people and on their lives and their situations, and you're just this and you're just that, and we make pronouncements. And when we do that, it's like as if we are the master of the Word of God, of Torah, of the law, and we can apply that. And so that we're the judge of what is and is not obedience or appropriate in terms of the law. And he's saying, and he's talking about this in the context when people speak against each other, generally speaking, making naught, to use the old English, making naught of each other, doing them down, slandering. There is only one lawgiver, one judge, he says, and he's able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? And he's not talking about never making any moral comment about what's right or inappropriate, or saying to somebody, well, that was unfair, or that shouldn't have been. We have to make these evaluations, but we're just not the judge of the person, ultimately. We are not the determiner of who they are and how they stand before God. We are not the determiner of their motives. Even though sometimes something happens and we think, well, why did they do that? So it's about taking care in our evaluations, in the recognition, and this is thinking back to what Jesus said, when we make these judgments and pronouncements as if we're capable adequately of doing this, then God has to apply the same standards to us. And so Jesus warns us, if you put yourself in that place of judgment, then that means God has to make, because he's just and he doesn't prefer one person to the other, he has to make a judgment. He has to make a decision about you and what's appropriate really for you. As I say, that's not to say that we can't say this is right and that's wrong. We're talking about ultimate determination, verdicts, pronouncements, and we can, of course, make those judgments not just about other people, but about ourselves, about the past. We can make judgments about the church, the Church of Scotland, and actually, I feel this is an area where the enemy ensnares us, because when we make judgments in this way, we define things. Or we define possibly our situation, or we define a relationship that we have, a member of the family, or a neighbour, or we define the church, and we're putting it in a box, or it could be all sorts of things. We define our past, as I've said, and then we become ensnared in it. Because words are powerful and have an effect, and they're spiritually powerful, There's a whole theme, but we've never really properly opened up about that. But they can act like a curse that restricts and deprives rather than sets free, which is what blessing does. The blessing is there to prosper us. And this is all in the context of James saying, look, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Just submit yourselves to God. Say no to the devil, he'll flee. Come near to God, he'll lift you up. Just humble yourselves and let him raise you. And he'll go on and he'll talk, we haven't looked at this yet, but not just about how we make judgments about other people and ourselves, but judgments about our plans for the future. Judgments in terms of what material possessions we've got and how it's all a call to bow and to humble ourselves, to submit and yield to God. He's the one who's the judge. He's just, he's good, he's merciful, he loves us to bits. So then when we read in 1 Corinthians 11, as we've read this morning, where it begins with earlier on, it's a familiar passage. I received from the Lord what I passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he'd given thanks, broke it, and said, this is my body, it's given to you, do this in remembrance of me. The same way he took our supper, took the cup. This cup is a new covenant in my blood. As often you drink it, do it in remembrance of me. But then it goes on. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. A man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body, discerning the body of the Lord, eats and drinks judgment on himself. And that's why many of you are weak and sick, and some of you have died. But if we judged ourselves, we would not come under judgment. When we're judged by the Lord, of course, we're being disciplined so that we'll not be condemned with the rest of the world. But brothers, when you come to eat, wait for each other. If anyone is hungry, they should eat at home. That's why when you meet together, so that when you meet together, it may not result in judgment. And you sort of might, first of all, be inclined to think, is this at complete odds with what James is saying? Is it, how are we to understand this? And we might even be tempted to say, is this inconsistent, in fact, with what Paul says in other places? I've put the reference on the part of service. You might like to look this particular one up with me. But it's 1 Corinthians 4 and verses 1 following. It's in a context where Paul is addressing divisions and arguments that are going on within the church. Some have come to faith and been discipled by him. Some have come to faith and been discipled by a man called Apollos, who had a great influence on the church. And some, by other means. And so there are some saying, well, I'm of Paul. Another saying, I'm of Apollos. That we go by him. And then the others, the most self-righteous of the lot, say, we're of Christ. And then there's this challenge to Paul as an apostle. And he says these words. People ought to regard us, me and Apollos and others, as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the secret things of God. And it's required, of course, that those who've been given a trust must prove faithful. But I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear. But of course that doesn't make me innocent. It's just that it's the Lord who judges me. So therefore judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He'll bring to light what is hidden in darkness and expose the motives of men's hearts. And at that time each will receive their praise from God. So he's saying in that context, I don't much care how the pronouncements and the judgments and the verdicts that you pronounce over me, or in fact that any human court does. I don't even pronounce those things over myself and my own life. Because I've given everything over to Christ. Now, he's not saying he doesn't care. He doesn't much care in the sense that he's not going to, of course it matters to him what others think. Of course it matters what they think of him because he cares for them. But he's giving all judgment over to Christ, which is the same as James is encouraging us to do. But is Paul now being inconsistent? Is he saying something complete? I mean, after all, it's the same letter. One is chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, the other is chapter 11. Is he saying, this is the way I regard myself? I don't really care too much about the judgments you pass on me, but you'd better examine yourselves. Context means everything. Context, in the one context, he is talking very clearly about verdicts and pronouncements, and we're thinking in the sort of legalities, he talks of court. But in this context here, where he's speaking to them there, he's talking about the Lord's Supper. He's talking about people who are coming and there's this kind of jostling about who sits where and who gets what to eat and drink and all the rest. And he says, so this is the context. And we have to remember that communion, or the Lord's Supper, wasn't just a token piece of bread or a token piece of wine, a token bit of wine. It was in the context of a meal. And he says, I hear that your meetings are doing more harm than good, that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And of course, there have to be differences, to some degree, so that ultimately you get to know God's view on things. But when you come together, this is not the Lord's Supper you're eating, for as you eat, some of you go ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church and humiliate those who have nothing? Can I praise you for this? No, certainly not. And he goes on, he talks about Jesus and his self-giving. This is my body, this is my blood. This is, how he's poured out his life for us. And that what we're doing when we celebrate this is that we're enjoying and rejoicing in that. And he's saying, look, if you're coming and you're celebrating the mercy of God and yet treating each other like this, at communion, then it's totally inconsistent. So take a hard look at yourselves, friends. Because if you persist in that, then at the Lord's table, the very moment that you're celebrating the mercy of God, then when you're making all these judgments and decisions and in this practical way, then it forces God, because you're calling upon him, it means that he's got to make decisions about you. But you see, this has been in our Western tradition, and it's partly why I wanted to address it. I mean, when we originally read James 4, and I wanted to pick up on judgments, because I think it's actually a vital issue for us. Because it's about our freedom. And it's about the freedom to allow God to move in our situations, in our lives, in our church, in our community. But then there is this passage, and I don't know how familiar it is to you, but it has had a long and quite troubling interpretation through our Western traditions. Because there's been this underlying sense of, you must examine yourself before you come to the Lord's table. And you can't take of the bread and wine unless you're worthy. After self-examination, that is. And it requires a proper discernment of the body, and you must know what you're doing. And it's caused enormous problems. See, and this is in our Western Latin tradition, whether it's Roman Catholic or it's Protestant. In that Roman Catholic tradition, you have to come to confession before you can take Mass. Now, there's nothing wrong with confession. It's good. It's liberating and it's healing, and there's great benefit too in confessing to a particular person. But it's not a requirement. If you don't come to confession before, it's not because they're making you unworthy or you've committed some sort of mortal sin. In our Protestant tradition, there was this notion, and it's still there in elements of particularly Northwest Highlands and certain traditions, that there's a need to fence the table, the communion table. To put this barrier around it so that nobody takes inappropriately or lightly of the Lord's table, and that they are properly examining themselves and counting themselves to be in the right place, and they have to properly understand what they're doing. And so in our this is our church tradition, that it was the duty of elders to examine members of the congregation and to test them with the Westminster Confession, whether they could give adequate articulation to their faith and adequately understood what the Lord's table was about. And if they met the standard, they were given a token to admit them to communion. And some of you will remember communion cards that were given out. Well, that was what went on after they abandoned the lead communion tokens. You can see one or two, by the way, up on the right as you go out the door there. Once they abandoned that, they gave cards, which was an invitation. But what happened was it threw people back on themselves to evaluate and self-examine and to judge themselves. And the majority of people, when they did that, they did not count themselves worthy. And so what took place, and in very few churches, but it still does in some quarters, not so much Church of Scotland, there may be other Presbyterian denominations, you can have a full church week after week after week, and then come Communion Sunday, you're down to 20. 100, 200, and it's gone to that. Or the sort of hangover for that. Well, life's all a bit sort of up in the air at the moment, and we're having all sorts of issues, and there's things you haven't gotten sorted out and right in your life, and all sort of difficulties at home. Can I come to the Lord's table? I'm not good enough. And then there's our other problems. Well, what do we then say about children? How much, at what point does a person adequately understand enough so that we can then admit them to the Lord's table? And what do we say about people who have learning difficulties? I remember when I went to university, there was a girl the same year as me. In the hall of residence where I was, she came from Musselburgh. Her younger brother had learning difficulties, and the Kirk session at that point having a huge discussion about whether or not he should be admitted to communion. How much did he understand? How much did they know that he knew? This is not what Paul is saying. Context is everything. Just maybe a kind of daft example. You might say in one context to someone, I don't know if anybody plays golf, so don't take it personally if you do, but someone who's always on the golf course. And you might want to say to the person, if you care about your family, give up the golf. Because maybe they're, neglecting their family. But you might say to someone else who's stressed out at work and they've no real means of relaxation. They're coming home and they're, of course, bringing that stress and pressure into the family, and then finding they get all grumpy and all manner of fallouts. They say, look, here's some golf clubs. There's a subscription. Go and get yourself out there. Two totally different contexts, two totally different ways. But it's particular to the context. But what's happened is that in our Western legal tradition, we've taken this and set it against things that Jesus said about judgment, that James has said and Paul says in other places. And we've thrown people back on themselves. See, I don't know, there's two minds where to put this. If you've ever fished, or you've a child or a nephew or whatever it is who's fished, but if you've ever fished, you'll have seen something like this. Yes, the nylon in a huge muddle. You get, yes? And if you see what happens is it spins and it twists, and then sometimes it's just, without doing anything wrong, it just does it of its own accord because there's a twist in the line. In order to disentangle that, you've got to find, actually here's one, I just happened to see it. You've got to find the end and the beginning. You've got to be able to trace it through and untangle that. And you will find knots, more than likely, probably quite firm knots that are almost impossible, if not impossible, to undo without damaging the line. And even if you do get them untangled, there will be a permanent kink in the line. And the whole thing has its twist anyway that has to be untwisted in order to be able to use it properly. So what a fisherman will do is cut it and not bother. It'll take you hours if you ever end up with a successful job. See, the reality is that for much of our lives and situation, actually that is perhaps a good picture. And we don't know the end from the beginning. And we don't know how to disentangle the whole thing. We don't know where the rights and the wrongs are, and what proportion this and who proportion that. And yes, I said that, but maybe I shouldn't have done it in quite the same way, or said it in that tone. Or we make all. Are we the judge? Can we disentangle it? See what, if we are to make a judgment, perhaps the only judgment we could make is it's a mess. The only judgment we can make is it's a muddle. Or, I don't know. I don't know the beginning and the end. I don't know how to sort it out. And we can say that about our past and our background. We can say that about our situations. We can say that about other people. Take a look at yourself, you say. God's the judge. He's the only one who can sort things. But you see, I did mention last week, and I want to spend just 2 or 3 moments looking at this, that judgment in our thinking, our Western thinking, we tend to think legal judgment, and we tend to think judgment condemnation. And yet, and in so doing, we miss the richness of the Bible's theme because it comes again and again and again about God as judge. It talks about the judgment seat of Christ. In biblical thought, in Old Testament thought, and it's carried forward because it's written by mostly Jews in the New Testament, judgment sits side by side with deliverance. It sits side by side with salvation. Because although there were people who were decision makers in cases, acted like a sort of judge in some ways, that their role was to defend the innocent, to protect the poor, to guard against injustice so that people were not inappropriately treated. It was a positive thing. It was probably not all about, primarily about finding fault. And when we read many passages in the Old Testament, and this is just a tiny smattering. It talks in Isaiah 11, and I put 1 or 2 references on the sheet here. Isaiah 11, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. It's speaking about Jesus. Spirit of wisdom and understanding, Spirit of counsel and power, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he'll delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness judge the needy. See, if we're equating judge with condemnation, or we're thinking of judge in a legal sense, that doesn't make sense. It's deliver the needy. Psalm 9, the Lord reigns forever. He's established his throne for judgment. He will judge the world in righteousness and govern the peoples with justice. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And you see again and again, when that side by side with the words judgment, he goes on and talks about salvation or deliverance. And one of the most significant places is in the book of Judges. You know, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Judges. Genesis is about the beginnings, and it takes up to the point when you've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then you've got Joseph, and the children end up in Egypt. And then Exodus begins, and Moses sets them free after several hundred years, takes them to the Red Sea, through the wilderness, onto the edge of the promised land. And that's Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then there's Joshua, and Joshua takes over, and he leads them into the promised land. And then you've got what's called the period of the judges. Joshua has died. And it's not yet the point where they have a king. And in the book of Judges, there's this repeated theme. They had no king, And everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Yeah, the tribes were in their different parts of the land, but there were these constant battles they were having to face because up were coming their different enemies, different nations coming against them. And they had no king. They had no fixed leader. And so God raised up from time to time leaders to set them free. But part of the problem, or the real root of the problem, was that they were faithful to God one moment, and then as soon as God, they started really enjoying the blessings, they fell away. And then the enemies began to oppress them, and they turned back to God, and God raised up this person who set them free, and then they, after a while, went back to their old ways, and worse than before. And then in came the enemies, and so back they turned to God, and again he raised a leader, and so it goes on. And that's the theme in the book of Judges. It's really for several hundred years. But you sort of think, well, why is it called the period of the judges? What are these judges all about? And so I've put this passage here, and it's spelt out for us in Judges chapter 2. The Lord raised up judges who saved them, delivered them out of the hands of the raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. And unlike their fathers, they quickly turned away from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to their ways, even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. You get the picture? The judge was the deliverer. It wasn't someone sitting like with a law court. It was someone who could bring justice into the situation and set them free. And so God raised up these judges, and he raised up a savior or a deliverer in Deborah, if you know the story, or in Gideon, if you know that story, or in Samson, if you know that story. And after these things, that they judged Israel for 20 years or 30 or whatever number it was years. And what they mean is they set Israel free. They had a period of respite. Judgment is about deliverance. Judgment is about salvation. That's what it's associated with. After the period of the judges, began the line of kings, and there was in David's heart, it was his son Solomon who built the temple. And at the heart of the temple, there's a court, then a building, the big part, the holy place, a room, small room, the Holy of Holies, where they had the Ark of the Covenant. And if you remember the various names, one of the names was the mercy seat. And if you remember too, perhaps, that God was enthroned in the understanding, in judgment above the mercy seat. In judgment, he remembers mercy. So here they are, 1 Corinthians. They're coming to enjoy and to celebrate salvation, to enjoy and celebrate the mercy of God. My purpose this morning is simply, I was going to end with this, but he's the sorter-outer. It would be unlikely that there was no one here this morning who doesn't feel a bit like this. You may not, but more than likely, more than one does. And we certainly do from time to time. We don't know. All if we have to make a judgment is just say it's a muddle. And my life's not sorted out. There is only one sorter-outer. And he's the judge. Weigh up, consider. Consider our need. Consider the marvelous blessings. We're going to finish, not just now, but in a moment or two, we're going to sing as our final song, Rejoice, the Lord is King. And we'll sing that verse that ends the final verse. Rejoice in glorious hope. Jesus the judge shall come and take his servants up to their eternal home. That's their Father. We soon shall hear the archangel's voice. The trump of God shall sound. Rejoice. Rejoice in glorious hope. We have a judge. One of the things when I was a part-time chaplain in mental health was I had the great privilege of being able to speak to people in a different way from the officials. But I could say one or two things that others couldn't say. When people told me sad stories, I could say, and I could say because of the scriptures, what happened or what was done or what was said was wrong. In fact, and I would say, and as a Christian, we would sometimes maybe even use the word sin. See, the officials couldn't say that. But people, when they'd been badly treated, needed to know it's not just my feelings of hurt. It's wrong what has happened. And I could say that as a privilege. When we invite Jesus into our situation. And having done that, you could then also talk about forgiveness. Which again, the psychiatrists and nurses struggled to do. Because they didn't have that because they couldn't speak from that moral perspective. And time and again, I saw people beginning to walk free. Inviting Jesus as judge is liberating. But it requires the laying down of our judgments about ourselves, our past, our judgments about each other, judgments about church, whatever. And that's what I'd like to invite us to do. We don't know the end from the beginning. But God does, and he's good.